The wind howled through the mountains that evening, carrying with it the sound of something old, something forgotten. On a narrow road, hidden between tall pines and thick fog, stood a cabin that no one had lived in for years. Its roof sagged, its windows were broken, and its walls were dark with rot. Locals said it was beyond saving. But one grey morning, a small pickup truck stopped in front of it, and an elderly couple stepped out. They didn't look like much, tired faces, hands worn from work, eyes that carried both sadness and quiet strength. But they had come here for a reason no one else could understand. They had left behind everything: their house, their neighbors, even their children who hadn't called in years. The man had once been an engineer, the woman a teacher. They'd spent their lives building futures for others, but when they grew old, the world seemed to forget them. So they decided to disappear, not out of anger, but out of a quiet longing. They wanted peace. They wanted purpose again. The cabin had been abandoned for decades, left to crumble on the edge of the world. Vines had swallowed its walls, and moss grew thick across the stones. Still, when the old woman stepped inside and brushed her hand against the cracked wood, she smiled. "It can be beautiful again," she whispered. Her husband shook his head, half laughing, but deep down, he believed her. That first night, they slept on the floor, listening to the storm rattle the roof and the forest groan outside. The wind leaked through the holes in the walls, and the cold bit at their bones. But as they held each other close, something shifted in the air, a faint sense that maybe, just maybe, this broken place had been waiting for them. What they didn't know was that this cabin, this ruin high in the mountains, would become their greatest work of all, a creation born not from youth or wealth, but from love, memory, and the quiet determination to make something whole again. The mornings in the mountains started cold, the kind of cold that bit through gloves and settled deep into the bones. Yet, every day, the couple rose before dawn. The man would start the fire, stacking wood piece by piece until the first flames caught, and the woman would make tea over a small gas stove. They sat together in silence, watching the first light creep through the cracks in the walls. It wasn't comfort they felt, not yet, but something simpler, the feeling of being alive again. The cabin was a wreck. The roof leaked, the floors were uneven, and every wall seemed to tilt in a different direction. But they didn't see what it was. They saw what it could be. The man started with the foundation, lifting broken boards and reinforcing them with wood salvaged from fallen trees. His hands, once used to drawing blueprints, were now rough and blistered, but each cut and hammer strike felt like progress. The woman worked beside him, sweeping away dust, clearing the debris, and humming softly to fill the silence. It wasn't easy. There were days when the hammer slipped, or when rain poured through the roof faster than they could patch it. Once, a beam collapsed under its own weight, nearly crushing the man's foot. But every time something went wrong, they looked at each other and laughed. "This old house has a temper," she'd say. "Then we'll tame it," he'd reply. They had built their whole lives around others, for their children, for their work, for survival. But this time, they were building for themselves. Weeks turned into months. Slowly, the cabin began to change. The roof stood firm again. The old, sagging porch was replaced by one made of smooth planks they sanded by hand. Wild vines that once strangled the walls were trimmed and woven into baskets. The woman painted the doors a soft green, the same color she remembered from her childhood home. Inside, they hung lanterns that glowed at night like captured stars. It was still small, still imperfect, but when they stepped back and looked at it together, they saw warmth where there had been emptiness. The neighbors from the nearby village began to notice. Hikers passing by would stop and stare. "You two really live here?" one man asked, shaking his head. "You're too old for this kind of work." The woman smiled, brushing dirt from her hands. "Then it's good that work keeps us young," she said. Their days followed a rhythm now, quiet but full. Mornings were for fixing, afternoons for gardening, and evenings for watching the sun fade behind the peaks. They planted vegetables in the clearing behind the cabin, built a small pond fed by melted snow, and even carved a bench out of an old log. Every corner of the place bore their touch, a piece of their story stitched into the land. Sometimes, as she hung laundry to dry on the line, the woman would think about their children, where they were, what they were doing. She'd remember the last phone call, the hurried voices, the polite goodbyes that sounded like distance disguised as care. But then she'd look around, at the forest glowing gold in the afternoon light, at the man repairing the fence, and she'd smile. Here, they weren't waiting for anyone to remember them. They were too busy remembering themselves. One evening, The man found something strange while digging near the edge of the property, an old metal box buried beneath the dirt. He wiped it clean and brought it to the porch. Inside were faded photographs, letters, and a rusted key. The photos showed a young couple standing in front of the same cabin, smiling the way only people who built something from nothing could smile. The letters were written in neat cursive, talking about dreams, storms, and a promise to never leave the mountain. "Looks like we are not the first ones who loved this place," he said quietly. The woman ran her fingers over the old photographs and nodded. "Maybe it never really belonged to anyone," she said softly. "Maybe it just waits for people who need it." As night fell, they lit the lanterns again, the same ones that glowed through the cracks like hope. The mountain air grew cold, but inside, the fire burned bright. The cabin creaked softly as if it were breathing, alive again, not just from nails and wood, but from love, from persistence, and from the hearts of two people who refused to give up on a place, or on each other. As the months passed, the mountain changed around them. Spring arrived quietly, melting the snow that had blanketed their cabin for so long. Streams ran like silver veins through the hills, and the air smelled of pine and rain. The couple worked through it all, their hands moving in rhythm with the season. The woman planted flowers along the path leading to the porch, a burst of color against the dark wood. The man built a small stone wall by the garden, stacking each rock with care. It wasn't perfect, nothing they made ever was, but that was part of the charm. Every crooked beam, every uneven board told a story of effort, of love, of starting over. They had found a balance that no one else could understand. The world beyond the mountain moved too fast, full of noise and distraction. But here, the silence was alive. They didn't need phones or clocks. The forest became their calendar. They knew when it was morning by the call of the birds and when it was evening by the way the sun dipped behind the ridge. Still, there were moments when the past crept in. Sometimes the woman would sit by the window, staring into the trees, her thoughts miles away. The man would notice but never interrupt. "One day," she said quietly, "do you think they miss us?" He didn't need to ask who she meant. He just reached over, placed his hand on hers, and said, "Maybe one day they'll remember where to find us." Then they both smiled, not sadly, but with acceptance. They had built a new life here, and it was enough. One morning, while repairing the fence near the edge of the woods, the man heard a faint sound, laughter. Not birds, not wind. Human voices. He straightened up, surprised. Down the narrow path, he saw two hikers approaching. A young couple, backpacks slung over their shoulders. "We thought this place was abandoned," one of them said. The old man chuckled, leaning on his shovel. "It was. Until it wasn't." They asked for water, and the woman invited them inside. As the visitors sat by the fire, they couldn't stop looking around. "Did you build all this yourselves?" the young man asked. The woman nodded. "Every nail, every stone," she said softly. "We just gave the place a reason to breathe again." Before they left, the hikers took a photo with them and promised to return someday. When they were gone, the couple looked at each other and laughed. "Imagine," she said, "being someone's story to tell." That evening, as the sun set, the man walked outside and stood at the edge of their garden. The light hit the mountains just right, turning everything gold. The cabin behind him glowed warm against the darkening sky. He thought about all the years that had led them here, the noise, the city, the loneliness. How strange, he realized, that peace could come not from having everything, but from letting go of it all. When he went back inside, he found his wife writing in a small notebook by the fire. "What are you working on now?" he asked, sitting beside her. She smiled. "I'm just writing down what we've done here," she said. "Maybe someday, someone will find it and know this place had love in it." He nodded, glancing around. The room felt fuller somehow, not just with their things, but with life itself. The shelves were lined with jars of dried herbs, the walls decorated with her paintings, the air filled with the smell of wood smoke and tea. Outside, the mountain night began to fall. The crickets sang, the wind whispered through the trees, and the stars blinked awake, one by one. The man leaned back, closing his eyes, listening to the sounds that had become their world. He thought of how far they'd come, from the first day they stepped into this broken shell of a house, to now, when it stood proud, rebuilt not by money or youth, but by patience and love. Later, before they went to sleep, the woman placed her notebook on the windowsill, where the moonlight could touch it. "Do you think anyone will ever find this?" she asked. "Maybe," he said. But even if they don't, the mountain will remember. She looked at him, her eyes soft. Then that's enough, she whispered. And as the fire burned low, they lay there listening to the heartbeat of the cabin, the crack of wood, the sigh of the wind, a quiet reminder that they had turned a ruin into something eternal, simply by choosing to love it. Autumn arrived slowly, painting the mountain in deep golds and fiery reds. The air turned crisp, carrying the scent of pine needles and wood smoke. Each morning, the couple woke to a fog that rolled over the hills like a quiet sea, blurring the edges of the world. The cabin, once just a shelter, now felt alive, breathing, settling, growing with them. The vines they'd planted in spring had climbed the walls, and the flowers she'd tended all summer bowed gently in the cool wind. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful, the kind of stillness that made memories louder. They had lived here for more than a year now. Time didn't move the same way on the mountain. Days didn't pass, they unfolded, slow and steady, like pages in an old book. The man's beard had grown white, his hands slower with every repair. The woman's hair had turned silver, her laughter softer, but her eyes were brighter than ever. Every wrinkle, every scar on their hands, felt like proof of the life they had built, a life far from noise, far from the people who once forgot to call. One afternoon, the man was stacking wood near the porch when he heard her singing. It was the same song she used to hum when their children were young, a gentle tune about home and love. He stopped, leaned on his axe, and listened. Her voice carried through the air like something timeless. For a moment, he closed his eyes and let the melody sink in. It was strange how the same song could sound different after all these years, softer now, but heavier with meaning. Later that evening, they sat by the fire, watching the flames dance in the reflection of the window. The woman looked at the walls, now covered with photos, old and new. "You ever think about going back?" she asked quietly. He didn't answer right away. He just poked the fire, watching the sparks rise. "Back to what?" he said finally. "There's nothing there anymore." She nodded, understanding. The house they once lived in had been sold, their children busy with their own lives. This cabin, this mountain, was their world now. And for the first time, that felt enough. The next morning, a letter arrived in the small wooden box by the trail, a rare thing up there. It was from their daughter. The handwriting was neat, almost too careful. "We've been thinking about visiting," it said. "The kids want to see where you live now." The woman read the words aloud, her voice trembling slightly. For a long time, they just stared at the letter in silence. Then she smiled faintly and said, "It's time, isn't it?" They spent the next few days preparing the cabin. The man fixed the loose railing, swept the porch, and polished the old brass lanterns. The woman baked bread, humming as the scent filled the air. They weren't nervous, exactly, just unsure. So much had changed. When their daughter and grandchildren finally arrived, the mountain greeted them with clear skies and golden light. The children ran ahead, laughing as they spotted the cabin tucked among the trees. "It's like something from a storybook," one of them shouted. The woman smiled as they burst through the door, filling the quiet rooms with the sound of new life. Her daughter stood in the doorway, looking around, eyes glistening. "You did all this?" she asked. The old man nodded. "Every inch," he said softly. She touched the wall, tracing the grain of the wood. "It feels alive," she whispered. That evening, they all sat outside as the sun melted into the horizon. The grandchildren played in the yard, chasing fireflies while their laughter echoed off the trees. The woman leaned against her husband's shoulder and whispered, "Listen to that. The house finally remembers what it's like to have laughter inside." He smiled and squeezed her hand. Maybe it was waiting for it all along. After everyone went to sleep, the couple sat by the window, watching the lanterns flicker softly in the dark. The man turned to her and said, "You know, I used to think this place was saving us. But now I think we were saving it." She smiled, her eyes reflecting the firelight. Maybe we were saving each other. Outside, the wind brushed gently through the trees, carrying the faint sound of the children's dreams. The cabin stood steady against the night, glowing softly under the stars, holding inside it every heartbeat, every laugh, every quiet moment that had rebuilt not just a home, but a family that had found its way back to warmth. As the years passed, the cabin no longer looked like the wreck they had once found in the forest. It had grown into something extraordinary, a quiet masterpiece born from patience and care. The roof, once broken and sagging, now gleamed under the sun, and wild roses climbed up the porch rails, twisting like threads of memory. Birds nested under the eaves, and the garden behind the cabin overflowed with life. It wasn't the kind of beauty that came from money or planning. It was the kind that came from time, from loving something long enough for it to love you back. The couple had grown older, their steps slower, their hair whiter. Yet they moved with an ease that only comes when life's noise finally fades. Each morning, the man rose before dawn and stood by the window, watching mist drift through the valley. He'd make coffee while she watered the flowers, her gentle humming blending with the sound of the waking forest. Some days, they barely spoke. They didn't have to. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was full. One afternoon, as the wind carried the smell of rain, the woman brought out an old wooden chest from the corner of the room. Inside were all the letters they'd received from their children over the years, some apologetic, some full of promises to visit, others left unanswered. She sat quietly, reading through them one by one, her expression unreadable. When she reached the last one, she smiled softly. "They're happy," she said. The man nodded, sitting beside her. "That's all we ever wanted." Later that evening, the first drops of rain began to fall. The man lit the lanterns while she made tea, and the cabin glowed like a star in the growing dark. Outside, thunder rolled across the mountains, but inside, it felt like time had stopped. The woman reached for the man's hand. "Do you remember what this place looked like when we first came?" she asked, her eyes glimmering. He laughed quietly. "How could I forget? I thought you'd lost your mind." She chuckled. "Maybe I did. But I'd do it again." That night, the storm grew stronger. Rain hammered against the windows, and the wind roared through the trees. The man got up once to check the shutters, making sure they held firm. When he returned, she was asleep in a chair, the firelight flickering across her face. He stood there for a long moment, watching her, the same woman who had turned a ruin into a home, who had turned his life into something worth staying for. He whispered, almost to himself, "We did it." By morning, the storm had passed. The air smelled fresh, washed clean by the rain. Sunlight broke through the clouds, falling in golden streaks across the garden. The man stepped outside, breathing deeply, his joints aching but his heart light. The world felt new again, as it always did after the rain. He turned back toward the door to call her for breakfast. But when he did, the words caught in his throat. She sat by the window, still and peaceful, her head resting gently against the frame. The teacup beside her had gone cold. For a moment, he didn't move. The silence of the cabin pressed around him, heavy and endless. He took a step closer, his hand trembling as he reached for hers. Her skin was cool, her face calm, as if she had simply drifted into a softer dream. He didn't cry. He just stood there, the world narrowing to the quiet rhythm of his heartbeat. He buried her beneath the tall pine tree behind the cabin, the same place where she'd planted wildflowers the first spring they lived there. He marked the spot with a small stone and carved her name into it by hand. Afterward, he sat there for hours, listening to the wind move through the branches, whispering like a voice he almost recognized. The cabin became quieter after that, but it never felt empty. Her touch lingered everywhere, in the scent of dried herbs hanging by the window, in the soft colors on the walls, in the flowers that refused to stop blooming. He kept her notebook on the table, reading a page every morning before he started his day. One line stayed with him more than any other. *, love doesn't end where life does. It stays, waiting in the quiet places. *, the years went on, and though his body weakened, he never left the mountain. Sometimes travelers came, drawn by stories of the old man who lived in a paradise he built himself. They'd find him sitting on the porch, smiling, his eyes distant but kind. And when they asked how he'd done it, how he had turned a ruin into beauty, he would simply point to the cabin, to the flowers, to the mountain, and say, "She showed me how." At night, when the stars shone bright above the peaks, he'd light a lantern and set it on the porch rail, letting its glow spill into the dark. He said it was for her, so she could always find her way home. And in the stillness of those nights, if one listened closely enough, it almost sounded like two voices whispering together again, as the mountain kept their story alive, just as it had promised to.